Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Brain Academy. On this episode, we're going to be dealing with lighting and post-processing. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we get started, I'm just going to showcase what the lighting kind of looks like at the moment. This is sort of what you've seen in the past. So I'm just going to jump into play mode. And in play mode, you can see that there is a light being cast from the player, and there's sort of a little bit of ambient light being cast on the entire scene as a whole, given that it's not pitch black. The player's navigating throughout, and you can see how the light is sort of casting shadows, illuminating the platforms, and so forth. I'm going to show you how to do that from the bottom up. So in between now and the next section, I'm just going to clear out the entire scene of all the lighting. See you in a bit. So now that I've turned off all the lights, you can see that everything's very dark and pitch black. I can't see anything, so I'm just going to toggle off and on the lights. When you do that, it eliminates all the lighting that's going on, all the shadows, so that you can see everything that's going on, especially if it's like a really, really dark level you have. I'm just going to go to rendering, lighting settings. So here's a little window, and just like every window, we can drag it on over to the side here. We can put wherever we want. See that there's this skybox in here? Well, that skybox is governing what is sort of going to be reflecting off of objects. So like if you look up in the sky, you can see that, but also if there's like a puddle underneath you, you can see the sky. I'm just gonna go ahead and delete this because we don't want the skybox reflecting off of anything. And now the ambient color in the background is just going to be this dark gray shade. That's going to prevent any interference with our lighting. Feel free to keep the skybox in there if it's important to you. I'm going to delete it for my purposes. Now I'm going to create a light, a directional light. And as you can see, the whole thing has now been illuminated. That's basically because I've added a sun to the scene. And you can change the direction of this light where it's pointing. I'm just going to zero it all out so I don't lose it anywhere. And you can find it whenever you want by just double-clicking on it at the left in the hierarchy. I'm just going to move it around because I kind of want it pointing towards the wall there because it's going to act as an ambient light. That's just a little bit of mood lighting to set the scene. You can adjust the intensity for darker or brighter. I'm going to want my game to be pretty dark, but I do want that ambient light still there, so I'm going to put it to a 0.1. And now we get to play around with sort of like the coloration of the game. I think I'm wanting mine around like this bluish color, maybe a little brighter like a cyan. You can make your thing red if it's sort of like a boss level, or purple or green or yellow, whatever you want. I'm going to set mine as this light blue. And now, so you can set real-time lighting. I'm going to turn on hard shadows, and as you can see, now it is casting shadow. Our sunlight, or in this case ambient light, is hitting the objects, and behind the objects, shadows are cast onto the backdrop. So just close all these up. And I'm going to want, in my environment, create an empty game object to hold my lighting. I'm going to call this lighting, because in case I have multiple directional lights, I'm going to want to put them all in here. And now my directional light is nice and hidden into my environment assets. Next, we're going to create another light, this time a point light. And point lights are sort of like light that is cast out from, you guessed it, a point. And you can see that it has this maximum radius around it. You can move it around, you can change the color of it. I like cyan because that's sort of like the mood I'm setting for my level here. You can change the intensity. That will brighten up the light that's being cast. You're going to want it pretty intense because it's going to be competing with the black scene going on here. And I'm going to move this light around a bit. I want to cast shadows though, and as you can see, it's casting shadows on the platform underneath it. By moving this light around, you can see that it's casting light wherever it touches, and I'm going to want this point light to be right in the face of my character. because what this point light is going to be doing is it's going to cast light from my character, so when I'm moving around I can see everywhere I'm going. Because he's a robot, it sort of makes narrative sense as well, but because my scene is pretty dark, I'm going to want him to be casting light. So there are two ways to add a light. One is to go into the game object and create one, and the other way is to make an empty game object, and you can call it whatever you want. I'll just call it light, and then add the light component. And it does the exact same thing, so it's just showcasing multiple ways. You can change the range to sort of like block the light from going past that range. You can alter the intensity so that it intensifies the light all the way up to your maximum range there. You can change the colors to whatever you want. And ultimately, as I was putting it before, I want these lights to be illuminating where the player goes. And the only way to really do that is to attach it to my player. So I'm gonna first call this player_light, just for organizational purposes, and drag it into my player prefab. And you can see that it does sort of like a little plus sign beside that. That just means it is added to a prefab without breaking the prefab or changing it. And you can see that now the light is following me, and it is illuminating the background. So far that's a success. We have this nice ambient light being cast on the background, and we have the player also casting a cyan-colored light. So let's create a spotlight. We've gone through the directional light and the point light. This time let's try the spot. You can see it differs from the other two that we've looked at, primarily in that the light emits contained within the cone you see coming from a center point. Now that we've got one of each type, we can look more closely at the component parameters. We already played with intensity, which affects how bright the light is. The settings for the shadows are pretty self-explanatory as well. They really just trade off between fidelity and performance. Soft shadows are more realistic, but more intensive to calculate. The strength of the shadows can also be adjusted, which is a modifier based on the intensity. Near plane culling can be applied to prevent shadows from blocking a player's view, the same way near plane culling works for geometry. There are scenarios in which a culling mask can be useful, to quickly hide shadows in different camera views, for example. The point light has much the same settings as the directional light, except that it has a range setting. No matter the intensity, the light will not escape the range of the light. This is different than the directional light, which is a light that sort of is kind of like a sun shining down. Here it should be noted that the renderer we are using prevents much of the real-time shadows, as it is meant for more of lightweight renderer workloads, primarily for performance reasons. The spotlight, again, is mostly the same, but here, in addition to a range parameter, we have a spot angle parameter, and the direction the light is facing matters. I want to talk a little bit about lighting probes. Unfortunately, we can't really add them to the scene based off of our setup. They are primarily used in real-time lighting environments and are essential to photoreal operations in Unity. They work as sort of like area lights, like a point light, but as a 3D piece of geometry affecting an environment. We aren't using that for our setup. In fact, it's not very useful, so I'm not going to cover it, but we will have some links in the description if you want to delve into that a little bit more. Reflection probes are somewhat out of the scope of this project, but I will touch on them. They are used as an in-engine way to make something reflective. As with lighting probes, they are most useful in real-time work. Setting the time to real-time, the refresh mode to every time, and the time slicing to none will provide the best looking reflections. This will prevent them from becoming choppy with fast movement. As you can probably imagine, these are fairly taxing on the system. The intensity setting works the same way as the shadow intensity, being multiplicative of the light intensity. The resolution of the reflections can be modified, being a trade-off between fidelity and performance. Real-time lighting and reflection probing are something that requires some dedication to get right, and it's not something that any of us here at Brain Academy have a real particular skill in. If you're interested in learning more about real-time lighting, we recommend looking into tutorials specific to that workflow, and we'd be happy to provide some links in the description. Even though we made this folder in environment assets called library, we still have some trouble organizing all our lights, because see, this reflection probe isn't there, we have a point light on our player, we have a directional light. It's all really hard to track, but we do have this window in rendering called Light Explorer. Now this allows us to explore every single light in our scene. You can see our player light, we have directional lights, we have these spotlights. Let's click on one and see where it is. Spotlight, and we can see that our enemy here is casting a red light, a red spotlight off of him. And this allows us to control and edit all of our lights in our scene, from point, directional, even if we have a area light, it would all appear in here. And by double-clicking on these lights, we can find them really, really easily. So we have lights, we can see that we can change the type, shape, mode, color, intensity, and so forth. There's also these other tabs, reflection tab. We can delete or find our reflection probe. We deleted our light probe, so it's not here. And also check our static emissives. These are materials that have baked lighting already built into them. We can edit that lighting here. So it's a very useful tool, and I recommend having it open if you're doing any work in your scene regarding the lighting. So, now to talk about post-processing. Post-processing is that little thing that's going to make your game go from sort of like looking like you just made it to looking like it's pretty professional. It's going to be affecting your lighting, it's going to be affecting your camera, your player's view. But first things first, we have to install it. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to Window, Package Manager. And in there, we can see all the different packages we have in our scene. It's a window just like any other. You can drag it wherever you want. I like it right beside my hierarchy here. And we're going to scroll down until we find the post-processing package. And you can see we can look at all the versions, version 2.1.0, 2.1.5, 2.1.6. We want 2.1.7 because we know that works with our Unity version, and we'll just install it. This will just take a moment. And once that's done, we're good. And remember, you can remove these at any time. I'm just gonna close it because it's kind of in the way. And let's get to doing some post-processing. So in order to get post-processing to work, we have to assign it to a specific camera view. You can switch between camera views if you want post-processing to change throughout the game, or you can activate certain post-processing layers on a camera and switch between the two. But all we want to do for now is just get it set up. So the first thing you have to do is you have to go to your camera, your main camera. It could be attached to your player, it could be separate. In this case, we have it separate. Click on your camera and add a component, and that component's going to be the post-processing layer. Now, this layer is going to connect your post-processing setup with your camera. And as you can see, there's no layer selected. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to select a layer. I already have a layer set up, but I'm going to go through the motions with you. So under here you can see I have something called PP layer, meaning post-processing layer. But if you need to create one, you go to Edit Layers, open up a layer, and under User Layer 8, I have added PP layer there. And we're just going to make sure that the camera has that turned on. Now let's deal with the anti-aliasing. First, approximate anti-aliasing, or FXAA, is the most efficient form available. It only processes things based off of how they appear on the screen in 2D, rather than as 3D geometry in space. This is efficient for the trade-off of accuracy and sharpness. Subpixel morphological anti-aliasing, or SMAA, works similarly, but uses extra processing power to improve artifacting caused by downscaling. Temporal anti-aliasing, or TAA, works to reduce the effect of temporal aliasing, which happens when sampling rate of the camera is too slow and moving objects appear to behave in unusual ways. A classic example of this is when wheels that are spinning tend to look like they're spinning backwards at high speed. For general use and for our purposes, we will be using SMAA, which will generally provide the best result of these three. So the script on the camera itself isn't going to necessarily deal with the post-processing setup that we want. At least it's not going to allow us to customize anything. The first thing we're going to do is create an empty game object, and this is going to hold a component called post-processing volume. Now this volume is going to be what governs everything. We're going to be able to edit stuff. I'm just going to rename the empty game object to post-processing. You can put the component on the main camera as well, but for organizational purposes, I'm just going to put it on here. I'm going to have to set it to is global, and now we're going to select new for profile. You can select an already existing profile if you have one saved. So now let's go through all the different options. First, we got ambient occlusion, and you can see how we can make all of these different modifications. I'm just going to quickly fast forward through all the options here. So as I was going through the options and scrubbing through them, you may have noticed the fact that nothing's really being edited here. And that's because we haven't set it up to respond to the layer we have on our main camera. So if we go over to our main camera, you can see it is a layer called PP layer. We have to make our post-processing volume also be on that layer. And I don't know if we've covered layers yet before, but you can switch a layer by just selecting up there, PP layer. Now, nothing has changed because we have no effects, so let's add some effects. Let's add vignette. I don't know how to speak. And as you can see, we're sort of fish-eyeing it. You don't get a good feel for what it looks like in-game, but you can see something happening in the inspector. But when we switch over to game, you can see what it actually looks like when you start playing. And I'm just going to play around with this. If we want a really, really dark level, we can make it very, very intense and closed. I think I just want a subtle intensity there. Make it a little black. And now I'm going to add another effect. And let's just add some color grading. Color grading is going to allow you to add sort of like hues over top. I want a high definition range. Add some temperature. I think I want it to feel a little cold, sort of like a metallic, oppressive feel to it. And you can play around with all of these things, and it's really just to set that feel for your game. I apologize for that. That was a little bright. If you want your game to feel exposed, you can play around with these options. See, ooh, really dark. I don't think I like that. But if you want your game to be really, really red, you can do that. And I don't claim to be an expert, but just like playing with these things, you can make it vintage. You can sort of suck the color out of it. I think I like my color. You could like oversaturate your game, add certain hues to your game. I'm not going to play too much with that. A couple more maybe. Add a depth of field. So if you ever played with lenses before or cameras, this one might be fun for you. This is sort of just like adding, making things in the background sort of be out of focus, but I still want the character to be in focus, so I'll just play around a little bit with this. You can change aperture, focal length. If you're a camera guy, this is going to be your favorite thing, or camera girl. And I think I'm going to add one more after this, and I think I'm going to add a blur. A bloom. And the bloom is going to make everything sort of just pop a little bit more. In fact, we can go overboard, and I think I do want to go overboard, so I'm just going to turn all these on and play around with it. If you bump up the intensity, you can see how all the lights are sort of just like radiating this intense glow. You can play around with the threshold to sort of cap it. So when I go into play mode here, you can see how everything has just like exploded with this like, it sort of feels neon-y. And if that's kind of the feel you want to go for, do it. because that's really what post-processing is about. It's about making your game feel how it was meant to be felt. I don't think I necessarily like this, so we might not go with this for the final thing, but it does sort of accentuate like how different it looks. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Brain Academy. This is one of those areas where you can dive down pretty deep. Even on AAA teams, like, just handling post-processing is a dedicated job. So don't feel bad if you weren't able to keep up with it or feel like you're not too experienced with it yet. It is, after all, like our first time going through it. A lot of time needs to be spent fiddling with these things just so you can get that feel right where you want it. On the next episode, we will be dealing with particles and polish. We've already stepped into the polish area, but that episode is going to be specifically dealing with making your game ready to be built, ready to be published, ready to be played. So, I hope you join us on that episode, and thanks for watching. Stay frosty.